The screams cut through Alexandria's morning air like a blade. Marble echoes with violence while hands reach toward a brilliant mind. The acrid smell of fear mingles with incense from nearby altars. It's March 415 CE, and the ancient world's greatest female philosopher faces her final moments. But just hours earlier, different story entirely. The same streets buzzed with scholarly debate. Students hurried between libraries clutching papyrus scrolls. Merchants hawked spices while philosophers argued geometry under marble columns. Alexandria still hummed with intellectual energy, even in decline. This calm wouldn't last the morning. What you just witnessed wasn't just murder. It was the systematic execution of rational thought itself. History has sanitized Hypatia's death, reduced it to a footnote about religious tensions or gender conflicts. But dig deeper, and you'll find something far more sinister. Hypatia died because she represented a terrifying idea, that truth comes through investigation, not revelation, that knowledge belongs to humanity, not institutions, that a human mind, any mind, can pierce through superstition and touch the divine through mathematics. Her murder wasn't random violence. It was a calculated strike against intellectual freedom that established a template used for centuries. When institutions feel threatened by inconvenient truths, they don't debate them. They eliminate the people who speak them. This is how civilization chose faith over reason, politics over truth, and mob rule over intellectual courage. Picture waking up in 4th century Alexandria. Harbor bells clang, merchant ships creak against their moorings. The city stretches before you in magnificent decay, still grand, but you can see the cracks in the marble, the weeds growing through broken statuary, the faded paint on once glorious facades. This is Alexandria 400 years after its founding by Alexander the Great, 2 centuries after Cleopatra's death, 1 century into Christian rule. The Great Library is mostly gone, destroyed bit by bit through budget cuts, religious conflicts, and simple neglect. But the museum still functions, still attracts scholars from across the known world. Hypatia's daily routine follows the same pattern her father established decades earlier. Rise before dawn in her villa near the museum district. The servants light oil lamps while she dresses, a simple white chiton fastened with bronze pins, dark hair bound back with leather cord. No jewelry, no cosmetics, no concessions to feminine display. She needs nothing to command attention except the force of her intellect. Think about her morning walk to the museum. She passes through streets that have seen Ptolemaic pharaohs, Roman emperors, Christian bishops. The same marble columns that once supported pagan temples now bear Christian crosses. Inscriptions in Greek, Latin, Coptic, and Hebrew jostle for space on public walls. This is a city where civilizations collide and blend. Her lectures begin at the 2nd hour after sunrise. Students gather in halls that echo with centuries of learning, some spaces older than Rome itself. These aren't casual discussions. We're talking about advanced mathematics and astronomy that wouldn't be taught in European universities for another 1,000 years.
But here's what makes Alexandria dangerous in 415 CE. It's a pressure cooker of competing worldviews. The Roman Empire has been officially Christian for over a century, but Alexandria clings to its cosmopolitan traditions. You've got pagan philosophers teaching Aristotle alongside Christian theologians debating the Trinity. Jewish scholars interpreting Scripture while Gnostic mystics claim secret knowledge. All crammed together in a city that's seen its population and prosperity steadily decline. The economic pressures make everything worse. Alexandria's wealth came from being the Mediterranean's intellectual capital, the place where knowledge was created and preserved. But as the empire Christianizes, that monopoly faces serious challenges. Christian schools in Constantinople and Antioch compete for the same students. Pagan learning starts looking not just obsolete, but actively subversive. Now imagine Hypatia's impossible position in this world. She's a woman, exercising intellectual authority in a society that legally treats women as perpetual minors. She's the daughter of Theon, a renowned mathematician, so she's inherited not just knowledge, but institutional legitimacy. This makes her simultaneously powerful and vulnerable. Her male colleagues, who would dismiss almost any other woman as intellectually inferior, actually listen to her arguments, cite her work, seek her consultation on difficult problems. Government officials rely on her astronomical calculations for everything from tax collection to military campaigns. She moves through Alexandria's power structures with remarkable freedom. For a woman. But that freedom comes with a price. Every public appearance reinforces her anomalous status. Every successful prediction or elegant proof demonstrates that pagan methods can solve problems Christian theology can't touch. Every student she teaches carries her influence into the broader world. Think about her evening routine. After the formal lectures and consultations, she returns to her villa for private research. This is where she works on her commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest, trying to preserve and extend astronomical knowledge that took centuries to accumulate. She uses instruments her father designed, bronze astrolabes, armillary spheres, geometric compasses of remarkable precision. The irony is devastating. While she's mapping the heavens and calculating planetary motions, forces are aligning that will destroy not just her life, but the entire intellectual tradition she represents. She can predict eclipses decades in advance, but she can't see the eclipse of reason approaching her own city. 412 CE. Alexandria's Archbishop Theophilus dies. His nephew Cyril inherits the position, and everything changes overnight. Theophilus had been pragmatic, live and let live mostly. But Cyril had bigger plans. He didn't just want religious authority, he wanted total control. Within months, he's orchestrating attacks on synagogues, closing pagan temples, demanding that all education conform to Christian doctrine. The collision comes when Orestes, Alexandria's Roman prefect and Hypatia's close friend, refuses to bow to Cyril's expanding power. You've got imperial law versus divine mandate. When these forces clash, Hypatia gets caught in the middle. But here's the key. Cyril recognizes that Hypatia is the real threat. She's not just Orestes' advisor, she's the intellectual backbone of pagan resistance. She gives rational arguments to imperial authority. She proves that pagan learning can solve real problems that Christian theology can't touch. Cyril's solution is elegant in its brutality. Eliminate the philosopher, and the resistance loses its intellectual foundation. The mob would do the dirty work, his hands would stay clean.
The assault begins systematically. Cyril's followers start disrupting Hypatia's lectures with religious chanting. Students have to shout over hymns about salvation. They vandalize the museum walls, calling her a witch and seducer of souls. City guards? They're caught between imperial and church authority. They do nothing. Let me pause here to explain why Hypatia was so threatening to early Christianity. We're talking about 415 CE, when the church is still figuring out its basic theology. Church fathers like Augustine are wrestling with fundamental questions, faith versus reason, divine knowledge versus human investigation. Hypatia's entire approach challenged Christian doctrine at its foundation. Where theologians found truth in Scripture and revelation, she found it through observation and mathematical proof. Where they saw divine mystery, she saw natural phenomena waiting to be understood. Take her work on conic sections, mathematical curves that describe planetary motion. To Hypatia, these equations revealed the hidden architecture of creation. But to Christian authorities, this made God's creation seem mechanical rather than miraculous, understandable rather than mysterious. That's heresy, and heresy gets you killed. Back to the escalating crisis. By 414 CE, the conflict between Orestes and Cyril has exploded into street warfare. When Cyril's followers stone the prefect during a public ceremony, Orestes arrests the perpetrators and executes one, a monk named Ammonius. Cyril's response? He declares Ammonius a martyr. The funeral becomes a rally against imperial authority. Moderate voices start disappearing from public discourse. Hypatia finds herself increasingly isolated. Here's the second key context you need to understand: early Christian political theology. We're not talking about later medieval Christianity with its sophisticated philosophical traditions. This is apocalyptic Christianity. Many believers expected Christ's imminent return and saw temporary institutions as obstacles to the divine kingdom. This theological framework turns political opposition into cosmic warfare. Orestes isn't just a Roman administrator, he becomes Satan's agent. Hypatia isn't just a pagan philosopher, she becomes a demonic temptress leading souls to damnation. You can't negotiate with demons. Violence becomes religiously mandated. Let me give you the third crucial context you need to understand: the specific mechanics of how mobs form and kill in ancient cities. Alexandria's urban layout creates perfect conditions for crowd psychology to overwhelm individual reason. The city's built around a grid pattern with wide main boulevards, perfect for assembling large crowds, but honeycombed with narrow street sides where small groups can gather unobserved. Religious festivals become recruiting opportunities. Market days turn into political rallies. Economic grievances merge with theological disputes. A grain shortage gets blamed on God's displeasure with pagan learning. A plague outbreak gets blamed on Jewish usury or Christian extremism, depending on who's blaming. Cyril understands these dynamics with the precision of a military strategist. He doesn't need to order Hypatia's murder explicitly. That would leave evidence. Instead, he creates conditions where violence becomes inevitable, even necessary in the minds of his followers. His servants follow a careful progression. First, general criticisms of pagan philosophy as empty speculation that distracts from salvation. Then more specific attacks on mathematical astronomy as an attempt to constrain God's creation within human reason. Finally, personal attacks on Hypatia as a seductress who leads Christian souls into damnation through the sorcery of mathematics. Think about how this rhetoric transforms her teaching from education into witchcraft, her students from scholars into victims, her astronomical calculations from science into demonic divination. By early 415 CE, the pressure has become unbearable. Hypatia can't appear in public without bodyguards, a concession that makes her look guilty of the accusations against her. Her lectures move from the museum's grand halls to private homes, reinforcing the impression that she's hiding something dangerous. Students report being followed by groups of young monks who demand to know what sorcery they're learning. Some parents forbid their children from attending her lectures. Others pull their sons out of Alexandria entirely, sending them to Constantinople or Athens, where the intellectual atmosphere is less poisoned. The net tightens with mathematical precision. Every day that passes without dramatic capitulation to Cyril's authority is seen as further proof of her dangerous obstinacy. Yet she continues teaching, continues her research, continues believing that reason can triumph over superstition. This isn't naivete. It's the tragic nobility of someone who cannot abandon the principles that define her existence, even when those principles become her death warrant. She spent her entire life believing that truth revealed through investigation will always triumph over prejudice imposed through authority. How can she accept that the world has changed so fundamentally that this is no longer true? Here's what she doesn't understand. The game has new rules. In the old Alexandria, intellectual disputes were settled through debate and evidence. But in Cyril's Alexandria, theological correctness trumps logical consistency. Faith doesn't need to prove itself to reason. Reason must justify itself to faith. And increasingly, it can't. March 15th, 415 CE, the Ides of March. The irony would be poetic if it weren't so horrific. On this date, 5 centuries earlier, Julius Caesar learned that no amount of power can protect you from those who believe they serve a higher cause. Now Hypatia is about to learn the same lesson. She wakes before dawn, as always, but this morning feels different.
The servants whisper among themselves, glancing at her with worried eyes. Word has reached them through the slave networks that connect every household in Alexandria. Something is planned for today. They beg her not to leave the villa. Hypatia makes the decision that kills her. A young student, barely 16, son of a merchant family, has been accused of sedition for attending her lectures. His trial is scheduled for the 3rd hour at the Caesareum. She decides to attend, to provide what support she can for a boy whose only crime was seeking knowledge. Friends have begged her to flee Alexandria. There are ships leaving daily for Constantinople, Athens, even distant Cordoba, where Visigothic kings still welcome scholars regardless of their religion. But leaving would mean abandoning her students, her research, everything she's worked to build. It would mean admitting that Cyril has won. She can't do it. This is her fatal miscalculation, applying rational thinking to an irrational situation, expecting civilized behavior from people who have abandoned civilization for zealotry. She travels through the morning city in her usual manner, a simple 2-wheeled carpentum drawn by a single horse, driven by Davidus, a Syrian slave who has served her family for 20 years. No armed escort, no attempt to disguise her identity. This is Hypatia asserting her right to move freely through her own city. The streets seem normal at first glance, merchants setting up their stalls, children playing with wooden hoops, citizens heading to the public baths. But if you look closer, you notice things. Groups of young men in monastic robes lingering at street corners, unusual crowds gathered around the forums, a tension in the air like the charge before a thunderstorm. The ambush comes near the ruins of the Great Serapeum, that magnificent temple complex destroyed by Cyril's uncle Theophilus in 391 CE. The location is deliberate, a reminder of what happens to pagan institutions that refuse to yield to Christian authority.
They emerge from side streets and ruined buildings with military precision. This isn't spontaneous religious fervor, it's a carefully orchestrated assassination. Peter the Lector, Cyril's right-hand man, leads the attack. But look at the faces in this crowd. These aren't ignorant peasants driven by blind faith. You've got educated members of Alexandria's Christian community, monks who can read Greek and Latin, clerks who keep church accounts, merchants who see political opportunity in religious violence. Some of these men have probably attended her lectures in the past, back when intellectual curiosity trumped theological conformity. Davidus tries to protect her, but he's quickly overwhelmed. A club strikes his head and he falls unconscious. He'll survive, but only to spend the rest of his life haunted by his failure to save her. Hands drag Hypatia from the cart with brutal efficiency. What happens next strips away any pretense of religious purpose. They remove her clothes, deliberately, systematically, transforming a respected philosopher into a vulnerable victim. This isn't theology, it's humiliation. Think about the symbolism. For 45 years, Hypatia has commanded respect through the force of her intellect, the elegance of her arguments, the precision of her calculations. Now they reduce her to powerlessness, stripping away not just her dignity, but her authority, her humanity itself. They drag her into the Caesareum, that magnificent structure built by Cleopatra to honor Mark Antony, later converted to Christian worship by Constantine. They're committing murder in God's house, surrounded by mosaics depicting Christ preaching love and forgiveness. The weapons they use reveal the premeditated nature of this killing. Ostraca, pottery shards that serve as writing tablets for those who can't afford papyrus. These aren't just broken pieces of ceramic, they're deliberately sharpened fragments, some as large as a man's palm, others small enough to work with precision. The edges are razor sharp from being broken against stone. The irony is devastating. They're killing her with the tools of literacy, using the very instruments of education and communication as lethal weapons. Every strike symbolically erases what she represents. Each pottery shard cuts away not just her life, but the intellectual tradition she embodies. Now imagine the sounds echoing through that sacred space. Cries of anguish pierce the air, the scraping of ceramic against marble floors as shards are gathered and regathered, the shuffle of feet as each perpetrator takes his turn, the labored breathing of a brilliant mind slowly weakening from countless wounds.
The atmosphere becomes overwhelming. The sight of Alexandria's greatest intellectual being systematically destroyed makes even some attackers hesitate. But the mob's momentum carries them forward. Historical analysis suggests this ordeal continues for nearly an hour. Think about that duration. 60 minutes of sustained attack with sharp pottery fragments. This isn't a quick death. The ostraca are used systematically across her body, causing countless small but deep cuts that gradually lead to massive loss of vital fluids. This isn't a moment of passionate violence. It's methodical, ritualistic, deliberate. The attackers work in rotation, ensuring everyone participates while prolonging her suffering. The sharp ceramic edges, designed to scrape text off wax tablets, now scrape away her life bit by bit. Each perpetrator ensures personal participation in destroying what she represents. They take turns not just because of crowd dynamics, but because each man needs to feel he's personally struck a blow against what they see as dangerous ideas. In their minds, they're not committing murder, they're defending their faith. Watch how Hypatia responds. Ancient sources agree on this remarkable detail. She doesn't beg, doesn't plead for mercy, doesn't promise to convert or flee Alexandria. Even as the pottery shards slowly drain her life away through hundreds of small wounds, she maintains the dignity that has defined her entire existence. Witnesses report that she continued speaking about geometric theorems until her voice grew too weak to continue. Her final words, according to Damascus the philosopher, were mathematical observations about the angles of the Caesareum's architecture. She died as she lived, thinking, calculating, seeking truth even in her final moments. When death finally comes, they continue their desecration. They carry what remains through Alexandria's streets. The same hands that write prayers and copy scripture now commit acts that defile the very city they claim to protect.
The most chilling detail emerges from multiple eyewitness accounts. Throughout this entire ordeal, many perpetrators continue singing hymns. They transform murder into worship, violence into religious devotion. By the 6th hour after sunrise, noon by our reckoning, it's finished. Alexandria's greatest philosopher is gone, her knowledge seemingly extinguished forever. The mob disperses with the casual efficiency of workmen completing a job. Within hours, normal life resumes with disturbing regularity. The same people who witnessed the attack walk to the market for their daily bread. Children play near the Caesareum. Merchants discuss prices while ash from Hypatia's funeral pyre settles on their goods. But something profound has died beyond one remarkable woman. The very idea that truth can be pursued through reason, rather than received through revelation, has been extinguished in Alexandria's streets. The notion that human inquiry can illuminate divine creation without threatening divine authority turns to ash at the Cinaron. The message is clear to every intellectual in the ancient world. This is what happens when human reason dares to challenge institutional authority. This is the price of pursuing truth wherever it leads, regardless of political convenience or theological correctness. They have killed Hypatia. But in doing so, they have revealed the brutality that underlies their claims to moral authority. The stain on their hands will never wash clean, no matter how many hymns they sing. The cover-up begins immediately. Within hours, Cyril's supporters are spreading alternative narratives to obscure their responsibility. Socrates Scholasticus, our best contemporary source, describes how certain hot-headed men killed Hypatia because she prevented reconciliation between Orestes and Cyril. Notice the careful language. Hot-headed suggests passion rather than planning, while blaming her influence obscures the attacker's agency. Damascus the philosopher, writing decades later, is more honest. When Cyril passed by her house and saw crowds at her door, he burned with envy and immediately plotted her death. This acknowledges direct involvement while revealing the deeper motivation, professional jealousy. Modern forensic pathology helps us understand what ancient sources euphemistically describe. The pottery shards, used as improvised cutting implements, would have caused what medical experts call death by 1,000 cuts. Each individual wound might not be fatal, but collectively they cause catastrophic loss of vital fluids and eventual organ failure. The method was deliberately chosen to maximize both suffering and symbolism.
Quick death by sword or strangling would have been merciful. Instead, they chose a method that would take time, ensure public spectacle, and use the very tools of learning as instruments of execution. The attack was designed to be prolonged and public, a warning to every intellectual in the ancient world. The psychological aftermath is devastating. Orestes, stripped of his most trusted advisor, quickly capitulates to Cyril's authority. Other pagan intellectuals flee Alexandria or convert. The museum's remaining scholars abandon controversial research. But here's the smoking gun. 20th century archaeological excavations uncovered financial records showing Cyril's church compensated Peter the Lector and other participants through strategic appointments and land grants. This wasn't religious passion, it was contracted murder. Think about the implications. Hypatia's murder establishes a template repeated throughout history. Identify intellectual threats, mobilize popular hatred through ideology, eliminate opposition while denying responsibility. Within decades, Alexandria's reputation as a center of learning collapses. Scholars migrate to Constantinople, Baghdad, Cordoba, carrying Greek knowledge beyond Christian extremism's reach. The most tragic loss? Hypatia had been working on a comprehensive commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest that would have preserved crucial astronomical observations. Her murder destroys not just her life, but centuries of accumulated scientific knowledge.
To understand how Hypatia's murder became inevitable, we need to examine the institutional complicity that made such violence not just possible, but predictable. Constantine's conversion to Christianity didn't just legalize the religion, it created an unprecedented fusion of political and religious authority. Theological disputes became matters of imperial policy. Intellectual diversity became inherently subversive. The legal framework was equally complicit. Roman law technically protected citizens from mob violence, but enforcement required cooperation between imperial and ecclesiastical authorities. When bishops commanded more popular loyalty than prefects, law became meaningless. Economic factors amplified these tensions. Alexandria's prosperity depended on intellectual prestige. As Christianity gained dominance, church authorities realized they could monopolize the education market by eliminating pagan competitors. The broader culture enabled violence through systematic dehumanization. Christian rhetoric portrayed pagan philosophers not as mistaken colleagues, but as demonic enemies of truth. This theological framework made murder seem like spiritual warfare. Consider how gender amplified these dynamics. Hypatia's authority challenged multiple hierarchies simultaneously. She threatened religious orthodoxy and patriarchal assumptions about women's intellectual capabilities. Her murder served multiple symbolic functions. The international dimension is equally significant. Other intellectual centers were watching Alexandria's response to Christian-pagan tensions. Hypatia's murder sent a clear message. The age of philosophical pluralism was ending. Most damaging was the precedent this established. Cyril's success proved that religious sentiment could override legal protections, that theological claims could justify any violence, that institutional authority could escape accountability through narrative control. Hypatia's death reverberates through history like a mathematical constant, invisible but fundamental to everything that follows. The immediate consequence appears in 529 CE. Emperor Justinian closes Plato's Academy in Athens, the world's oldest institution of higher learning. The philosophical tradition stretching back to Socrates dies exactly 114 years after Hypatia's murder. But knowledge doesn't die, it migrates. Islamic scholars in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo become the inheritors of Greek traditions that Christian Europe rejected. Al-Kindi, Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Hazan build directly upon work Hypatia preserved and extended. The specific loss of women's intellectual authority proves even more devastating. After Hypatia, no woman achieves comparable scholarly recognition in Europe for nearly 1,000 years. Her murder becomes the template for suppressing female intellectual ambition. The Renaissance rediscovery proves revealing. When European scholars encounter Islamic translations of her work in the 15th century, they initially refused to believe a woman could have produced such sophisticated mathematics. The Enlightenment finally begins rehabilitating her reputation, but even then focuses on victimhood rather than intellectual achievements. Voltaire and Diderot use her story to critique religious fanaticism while largely ignoring her contributions. This pattern continues into the modern era. When women began entering universities in the late 19th century, critics explicitly invoked Hypatia's fate as a warning. Her murder becomes a cautionary tale about exceeding proper spheres. Perhaps the most profound legacy involves Christianity itself.
Cyril's success in using mob violence to eliminate intellectual opposition establishes precedents justifying crusades, inquisitions, and witch trials for centuries. The scientific revolution represents, in part, the delayed fulfillment of Hypatia's vision. Galileo, Newton, Kepler built directly upon the intellectual foundation she died defending: truth through observation and mathematical reasoning. In 1919, exactly 1,504 years after her death, Cambridge University awards its first degrees to women. The ceremony occurs on March 15th, the Ides of March that witnessed Hypatia's murder. The symbolic resonance is impossible to ignore.
Think about how Hypatia's story echoes through our contemporary moment with chilling precision. Same dynamics, different costumes. Consider the systematic targeting of female intellectuals in authoritarian regimes today. Taliban Afghanistan banning women's education. Iranian authorities imprisoning female scientists. The pattern remains unchanged. Eliminate women's intellectual authority first. The rhetoric proves equally consistent. Medieval accusations of witchcraft become modern charges of corrupting influence or foreign manipulation. The fundamental claim stays the same. Women who assert intellectual authority threaten natural order. Digital technology adds new dimensions to ancient tactics. Online harassment campaigns perform the same function as Cyril's street mobs, creating conditions where rational discourse becomes impossible and moderate voices disappear. The institutional dynamics prove even more troubling. When universities, research institutions, or tech companies prioritize ideological conformity over intellectual diversity, they recreate the conditions that made Hypatia's murder inevitable. Different orthodoxies, same suppression mechanism. Climate science provides a particularly relevant parallel. Female climate researchers face harassment, death threats, and coordinated campaigns designed to discredit their work, not because their science is flawed, but because their conclusions threaten powerful interests. The pattern persists across 16 centuries. Perhaps most disturbing is how modern societies sanitize intellectual suppression, just as ancient Christian writers sanitized Hypatia's murder. We speak of cancel culture or deplatforming, rather than acknowledging systematic campaigns to eliminate inconvenient voices. The euphemisms change, the violence continues. Yet resistance persists with mathematical inevitability. Every attempt to suppress knowledge creates new channels for its transmission. Every murdered intellectual becomes a symbol inspiring future generations. Every institutional cover-up eventually faces historical reckoning. Hypatia's true victory lies not in her individual achievements, remarkable as they were, but in her demonstration that truth-seeking cannot be permanently suppressed. Her mathematical insights survived through Islamic preservation. Her astronomical observations influenced Renaissance science. Her philosophical courage inspires contemporary researchers facing their own mobs. We return now to that March morning in 415 CE, to cries cutting through Alexandria's dawn air like a blade, to marble echoing with violence while hands reach toward brilliance. But listen more carefully to those cries. They echo not just with pain, but with defiance. They carry the voice of every woman silenced for claiming intellectual authority. They speak for every scholar murdered for pursuing inconvenient truth. They cry out against every institution that chooses comfortable lies over difficult knowledge. The sorrow that flows between those ancient stones connects through time, linking Alexandria to Cambridge, to laboratories where women today map genomes and calculate orbital mechanics and decode climate data despite continuing threats. And that brilliant mind gasping beneath mob violence does not truly die. It fragments and spreads and reconstitutes in every student who chooses evidence over authority, in every researcher who pursues truth despite personal cost, in every voice that refuses silencing. They killed Hypatia of Alexandria on March 15, 415 CE. They ended her brilliant life with pottery shards in a Christian basilica while singing hymns of praise. They burned what remained at the Synaran. But they could not kill what she represented. They never can. The cries that cut through Alexandria's morning air still echo. The sorrow that marked white marble still flows. The brilliant mind that faced hatred still thinks, still calculates, still reaches toward truth in every laboratory, every classroom, every place where human reason dares to question received wisdom. They killed her, but they could not kill her ideas. They never can.
And that brings us to the end of Hypatia's story. What do you think? Was this a turning point in history, or just one of many tragedies lost to time? Should her legacy be remembered more for her philosophy or for the injustice of her final moments? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one.